This is the first of our 4 core modules in the Facing the Unthinkable course. What is abuse? In this module, we'll look at a number of issues that are important in understanding the safeguarding task. The sections that we are going to cover are who are the perpetrators, personal safety skills, and forms and definitions of abuse. This session is presented by David Pearson, who is CCPS founder and company secretary and one of our trainers.
Well, safeguarding is everyone's responsibility, whoever we happen to be. We might have responsibilities for children as a parent, carer, worker, or maybe not, but there's that sense in which everyone who makes up the adult population is responsible for the more vulnerable, whether we're talking about children or talking about adults. Now, one of the things that we have to do at the beginning of a session like this is to knock away some of the assumptions that we might have grown up with, particularly around the issue of who offends, against children in particular, where it happens and that sort of thing. I'm just wondering, as you're sitting there, what image is conjured up in your mind as I use the terms sexual offender or paedophile. I'm not going to ask you to share that particular image, but I am going to ask you to revisit that as we look at some of the facts. We know that children are rarely abused by strangers. A number of years ago, we were invited by the Sarah Payne Murder Inquiry team to provide training for a group of people in her home area as tensions were running high prior to the trial of her murderer, Roy Whiting. And a senior police officer said at the beginning of that session, he said, concentrate on Sarah Payne and you'll probably miss it for your own child. For what happened to Sarah Payne, as tragic as that was an extremely rare event. When Madeleine McCann was reported missing in Portugal, some newspapers said there's a greater chance of your child being struck by lightning than something like that happening. In fact, we've got a newspaper cutting which says there's a greater chance of being killed by a bee than being abducted by a stranger, says Gary Slapper. What a name for a child protection writer, Gary Slapper. So children are rarely abused by strangers. They are abused by both men and women. And between 1/3 and 1/4 of all abuse against children is committed by other children and young people. And sadly, people in positions of trust occasionally abuse children. And we know that children are abused in all kinds of backgrounds, cultures and situations. Is your organisation particularly vulnerable? Now, most people watching this are likely to be from a place of worship. Or maybe you're from some other community organisation. But if you are open to everyone, there's that sense in which we're just like the supermarket. And today people will be going into supermarkets representing a range of society's ills, and there'll be people who pose serious risk to children and others going to do their shopping. And in the same way as the supermarket manager has no idea who's coming through the doors to shop, nor do your pastors, your leaders, have any idea who might be coming into your place of worship. Because you see, the focus of our work as the church is out there, isn't it? It's where people are. It's in the alleyways, the streets, wherever people gather. And if we're doing our job as we need to be doing our job, then people are coming through our doors all the time. And I stress there will be those who do pose risk to children, and you won't necessarily know whether or not that's the case. So when it comes to safeguarding, we have to be streets ahead of everybody else, because our needs are far greater than schools, the Brownies, the Scouts and others who work with children and young people, because they can carefully check their adults who come through their doors and lock the doors effectively to everyone else. But we, quite rightly, work on an open door policy. Church can be a safe place for children and adults, but it won't just happen by accident. We have to work hard to make sure that it is. If you look at this bar chart, this is research carried out by the University of Huddersfield in 2008. It's about the perpetrators of sexual abuse and abductions. And this was in relation to 2,400 cases. And you will see on the bar chart that in these particular cases, just over 1/3 of the abusers were lone adult males. I wonder how many of you had as your mental image the lone adult male. Well, that's clearly only a part of the picture. You will see that groups of offenders amounted to about a quarter, and then when we're looking at children and young people who also abused other children and young people, again we're talking about a quarter, and lone adult females, 12%, thought by many to be a gross underestimate of the situation. And we'll be talking more about some of these categories later on. But we need to stress at this point that we're talking about known cases. In other words, situations that were reported, but it's still reckoned that most cases go unreported. So we only know about what we know about, but these findings are fairly typical in relation to other research that's been carried out in relation to the perpetrators of abuse. Now, whenever we provide training like this, there's always someone who says, haven't we become too PC? Hasn't all this safeguarding stuff gone overboard? Well, we'd actually agree with them, because I do believe there's a lot of nonsense talked about when it comes to safeguarding. And within CCPS, we have over the years been trying to develop what we would regard as good sense measures. And those good sense measures that you'll be hearing more about as you go through this training are based on experience. We're learning all the time through other people's pain. And we would like to make tribute at this point to the many, many, many people who've contributed over the years to our understanding of abuse, which has enabled us to develop the measures, the procedures, and the things that we talk about today. And when we're looking at this issue, I'm reminded very much of a visitor that we had to our office a number of years ago. On one particular occasion, it's someone who we know quite well, this particular person came and he was hopping mad because his daughter had just been on a school trip. His daughter, I need to say, was a 13-year-old young woman. She had special needs. She had limitations in what she could do to help herself. And before she had gone away on this school trip, Dad said to her, now it's going to be a hot day, beach situation. I don't want you coming back burnt, so make sure that you ask the teachers to help you put sun cream on. And when she came back from that school trip, she came back with great big blisters on her back, and her father said to her, I told you to ask the teachers to put sun cream on. And she said, well, I did, Dad, but they said they couldn't. It was child protection. Now, I call that neglect. Having said that children are at most risk from people they know well, what are we doing to help them protect themselves from all who might abuse? I believe there are some things that we can do. First of all, it's helping them to say no in certain circumstances and telling an adult. It begins with helping children understand boundaries, explaining to them, for example, that the bits covered by their swimming costume or their underwear are private, and if anyone touches them in those areas, to always tell mummy or daddy or another grown-up. Children don't generally tell about abuse. They may, in some circumstances, have been sworn to secrecy, but we can smash the power of secrecy. And again, that goes back to teaching simple principles when children are young, helping them to understand the sorts of secrets that can be kept. For example, surprises that everyone's going to know about later. But if a grown-up ever asks you to keep something secret, which is about something that you don't understand, or it's about someone being hurt, then always tell mummy or daddy or another grown-up. And if you're not sure, tell mummy or daddy or another grown-up anyway. Now, these very, very simple principles will keep many children safe. And in circumstances where devious people break through some of those defences, a child is more likely to tell you than not. The media-fed image that we have of child abuse is that you could spot it a mile off. The reality is very, very different from that. It's often difficult, if impossible, to know what, if anything, has happened to a child. I'm going to illustrate that for you by showing you a picture in a moment. Firstly, I just want to say this is a very graphic picture, so please make sure there are no children in the room as this is seen. The questions I want to pose as you look at this picture is, this is a picture drawn by a 7-year-old girl. Is this a normal picture that you might expect, or are you concerned about what might have led this 7-year-old girl to draw this in the first place? Secondly, What would you do if you discovered this in your children's group tomorrow? Okay, I guess there were a number of suggestions emerging from that discussion. The important thing is, of course, don't ignore the picture. You must take action. And one thing that you can do, if the child is still with you and hasn't left the group, is to say something to the child along the lines of, Mary, this is interesting, can you tell me about it? Because at that moment, the child might tell you what lay behind this picture. Roll this story on a matter of hours, let alone days, and she probably is going to sense people are bothered by it and she's not going to say. It will be important to write notes, what led to this particular picture being drawn, how you responded, a verbatim report, and it would be important then to contact your safeguarding coordinator for other action to be taken. Now, when we're looking at what you should avoid doing or saying, we would suggest that you don't tell the parents. That's not to say the parents shouldn't know, they need to know quickly, but just imagine, if you received a picture like this, how are you going to react? You could react in a way that inadvertently alerted someone who's behind the picture and a child might be silenced. Now, if you show any emotional response along the lines of panic because you can't cope with this, or maybe you are stressed out yourself, that's not actually good and it's not conducive in terms of the child talking to you further about it. If you tell the child off, that again is not going to help in trying to learn what's behind this picture. And the other thing that is important to realise is that we should not be asking questions. I mean, if you're saying, for example, even, who's this a picture of, a child who is traumatised as a result of being abused is not going to be able to answer that question and may well say it's somebody else, when in reality it's somebody quite different. So don't ask any questions, don't throw the picture away, and importantly, don't promise confidentiality. This picture was actually drawn by a 7-year-old in a private school. The teachers didn't do what we've just talked about. They in fact photocopied it, sent it to social services, who were understandably bothered by it. They spoke to their colleagues in health, in education and other agencies as they would. There was what we call a child protection inquiry. Now, whenever you're looking at a piece of information, you don't look at it in isolation. You need to see it as part of a bigger picture. And the bigger picture was that this child's behaviour was very disturbed in school. She used to go around on all fours, barking like a dog, meowing like a cat. There were lots of problems at home that I don't have time to go into. But suffice to say that such was the concern that the local authority decided to bring this matter before a court in relation to this girl and her 5-year-old brother. At that point, the children were being cared for by foster carers, and the court asked the child psychiatrist if he could give his interpretation of the picture. And he said, well, he'd rather see the original, which was a coloured drawing, rather than this black and white photocopy. The school were asked for the original. They said, oh, we've sent it home at the end of term. Horrors. But nevertheless, that proved quite interesting, because when the parents produced the picture, this is what they gave the psychiatrist. You can see that either the picture's been changed or it's a similar one. Well, superimposing one on top of another on acetates would show you that it's the same picture. The only conclusion that you can draw is that it's been altered. So the question is, who altered it and why? Now, the school had handed this in the first place, so I don't think they could have changed it. The only other people to have had possession of it were the parents, who denied changing it. So why am I telling you this story? Simply because when this came to court, it was thrown out for lack of evidence, and these two children returned home, and no one ever got to the bottom of that situation. Those parents ended up suing the local authority for wrongfully removing their child, and it went down in subsequent publicity as a child being removed for no reason at all. And yet we were clearly, most of us I think probably, quite bothered about what had led the child to draw this in the first place. But the thing that we're trying to stress here at this point is that you are in a unique situation. A child's just drawn this, she's more likely to tell you than anyone else at any point in what follows. if you do the right thing, it could be a gigantic leap to the truth. If you do one of the things that we suggested you should avoid, then all it might do is to help conceal the truth. It's not rocket science, is it? All of us can teach our workers to respond in this particular way in similar circumstances. And if a child or an adult wants to talk about abuse, then again, how you respond is quite similar. And this is something that Claudia will be explaining later on. In your workbook, you'll see that we have a picture of an onion. We've used this because our understanding of abuse as it's developed over the last few decades has been like peeling layers off this onion. In the 1960s, we became aware of issues to do with physical abuse. In the 1970s, much more aware of sexual abuse, the extent to which adults were abusing children in those circumstances. In the 1980s, groups of adults abusing children. And then as recently as the 1990s, we became more aware of the fact that females also sexually abuse children. But you know, there's not a finite number of layers on this onion, and we're discovering things all the time which are new that we're having to address. 20 years ago or more, downloading abusive images from the internet wasn't a problem for obvious reasons. It's now one of the biggest safeguarding issues, and my colleague Justin Humphreys will be talking about this in more detail in another section. Other online crimes against children and young people, again, are issues that we need to be very concerned about. Thinking of another area, I'd like to mention specifically children with special needs and adults for that matter. It's hard enough in ordinary circumstances to know when someone's been abused. It's even more difficult if you have an individual who's relying very heavily on adult care, and maybe there's a difficulty in understanding, learning problems, difficulties in communication, that sort of thing. So we just need to be very aware of the situation. It's not to say that there are lots of abusive carers around, but it is important to realise that we might not always be aware of what's happening in certain situations. And then I can think of another area in regard to spiritual abuse, which is something that you won't read of in government definitions in the way that I'm going to address it. But what we do see in CCPS is people who've suffered as a result of over-controlling leadership styles, where people's minds have been taken over effectively through abusive leadership. And again, that's something that we need to be aware of and to address. And that abuse of power, if you like, in those circumstances is very much what we see underlying other issues like bullying, whether it's in the school or the workplace, and domestic abuse. These are things that Pauline's going to be addressing a bit later on. But again, I stress, most people don't abuse. In all 4 nations of the UK, there are different definitions of abuse. But basically what we're thinking about are physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect and emotional abuse. But it is important that you look in the workbook and on our website for the latest definitions. I just want to highlight one particular point, and that relates to sexual abuse when we're considering other children and young people as perpetrators. Often there's a temptation to ignore such behaviour as child's play. Now, I'm not describing here stages which children will go through, you show me yours, I'll show you mine, or even young people sexually experimenting with each other. They're things which as a parent or a leader you might need to deal with. What I'm describing here is any exposure to age-inappropriate sexual activity or material. The babysitter child type situation, or even just activity between different young people where there's that power differential. Now, such things are often minimised by adults, but the effects on the victim can be as serious. And there are other important issues to consider as well. Why is the abuser doing it? It's quite possibly learnt behaviour. The perpetrator might also be the victim of someone else. Are other children being abused? There's rarely one victim in our experience, though of course there has to be a first one. And then the biggie really, will this person continue to abuse? Will it become a pattern throughout their lifetime? If they do and you've taken no action, what responsibility do you have for future abuse that person might commit? So what we are always saying is, look, if you're having to deal with a situation like this, take advice. You can contact CCPS, because situations like this need to be referred to the proper authorities so that appropriate action is taken, the victim receives proper support, and action taken to also bring help to that individual perpetrator to try to prevent further harm, both to the individual themselves and to others. The question we're often asked is, when is abuse abuse, in the sense that it has to be actioned by social services and maybe action taken as well through the courts to protect a child? It's around what we call the test of significant harm. In other words, there's the assumption that because none of us are perfect parents, all our children receive some degree of harm. We learn on the job, don't we? And often by the time we find out how to do it, they've gone. And if we had a time again, we do a lot of things differently. But the fact of the matter is that through our mistakes in child rearing, we haven't caused our children long-term harm. But harm which is actually affecting not just a child today, but tomorrow and all a child's tomorrows, and is having a longer term impact on that person's development as an adult, that is what we call significant harm. More information about that is in your workbook.
Thanks for watching this module, part of the Facing the Unthinkable Core Safeguarding Training course. Within this module, we explored a number of issues that are key in understanding safeguarding and our responsibilities in promoting the welfare of vulnerable people. Firstly, we learned that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. Regardless of what role we have, or whether in fact we have a formal role at all, we all have a part to play in protecting the vulnerable. Next, we learned that we need to be prepared to challenge our views and perceptions of sexual offenders. Sexual abuse knows no boundaries and is perpetrated by individuals of all ages, descriptions, professions, cultures and religions. Perpetrators are also male, female, adults and children. We then learned that the environments in which we have contact with children and vulnerable adults can be both safe and supportive, at the same time as presenting some real risks and vulnerabilities. We must be careful not to unwittingly create such risks and work hard to minimise the opportunities for abuse. We must exercise good sense when considering both preventative and responsive measures to abuse. We also learned that the need to help children protect themselves is of equal importance to ensuring that adults and workers are familiar with their responsibilities. Teaching them personal boundaries, how and when to say no, when to tell an adult, and knowing the difference between good secrets and bad secrets are all important messages to be communicated to children. We learned that the way in which we respond to children who may disclose abuse to us is critical and can make all the difference in terms of what happens next. Ensure that you're familiar with good working practice in this area and refer to your safeguarding policy and procedures. Next, we learned that the types and methods of abuse are evolving all the time. Our understanding of how children are being harmed in different ways is also developing. We must be aware, particularly of some of the environments in which abuse occurs, including online, whilst at the same time as acknowledging that the vast majority of abuse still occurs within the family. We then learned that there are 4 primary categories of child abuse that are recognised by the statutory agencies. These are physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse and neglect. We hope that you've enjoyed this module and that it has helped you to develop your understanding and practice in safeguarding vulnerable people. If you have been affected by any of the material in this module, please make contact with somebody that you trust that can assist you. Alternatively, please call our helpline on the number just given, where there will always be somebody able to speak with you.